We
are
The
water.
conservation
experts.
do
You
have
A
question.
all right.
So the question today is, what does conservation mean? So we're going to try to answer that for you, or together. So we'll just start by having the panelists introduce themselves, and then I'll do a small introduction, and we'll get right to it.
Mark Marlowe with Castle Rock Water in little town of Castle Rock that is no longer so little anymore. Anyways, director of that.
All right. Kevin Reedy with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and I'm the State Water Conservation Technical Specialist. It's a mouthful, but I do everything conservation and land use now too as well for the CWCB.
My name is Frank Alfone. I am the general manager for Mount Warner Water and Sanitation District. We are the home team district here today. And I wanted to just do a quick inventory. I see a few bottles of water. If you could kindly just throw those out. We are very proud of our water. It comes from the Fish Creek watershed, and it's very good, clean, raw water. And so I want to make sure that no one is drinking bottled water. I'm just kidding.
I'm Jim Yan. I'm the manager of the North Sterling Reservoir in Sterling, Colorado, and the Pruitt Reservoir, two plains reservoirs for the farmers. And I am also the South Platte director on the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And just a disclaimer, I'm not a water conservation expert, so even though we said it earlier.
And my name is Jenny Arndt, and I serve as chair of the House Ag, Livestock, and Natural Resources Committee at the Capitol. I represent House District 53, which includes Fort Collins and Colorado State University, and also serve as the vice chair of the Interim Water Review Committee. So the reason why we started, some of the reason why this panel is here today is some early discussions that I've had with the Colorado Water Congress. But I started learning about water 4 years ago. And I will say that due to term limits, the people of Colorado have basically said, in effect, we don't want experts in the Capitol. So I have full disclosure, I am not a water expert. I am a special educator by training, and then I was in higher education. So about 4 years ago, I started following around the Interim Water Committee to learn more, because I was alerted to the fact that with some term limits, some of the water knowledge was going to be missing from the General Assembly, and I thought, well, I'll just start trying to learn about this. So they didn't know it, but I kind of just stayed in the KOAs, and I came to every meeting and sat in back and just listened and learned as much as I could. And when people started talking about saving water and conserving water, as a complete novice, I kept thinking, well, I went to third grade, and I remembered that the water cycle is a closed system. So in my little pea brain, I was like, I don't know what they're talking about, and I don't know how we ever actually save water. And then the water plan came out with a 400,000 acre foot goal of conservation. So that made me wonder what we were talking about there. And it turns out the question that I've had rolling around from before I quit my job as a special ed teacher, you know, I still have that question. And it may not be the worst question. So then I learned a little more about water, and this is just a little personal anecdote, but, and Emily wants me to tell this story, but I was sitting with a very prominent Colorado politician who will remain nameless, and I was saying, you know, I really don't think that we net ever conserve water, we don't really save it. What we're doing, we're just retiming water, we're getting water where we want it, when we want it. And I'm not really sure about this word conservation. And this person almost jumped across the dinner table and choked me, and she said, I don't ever, ever want to hear you say that again, which I thought was very interesting. So my higher ed degree is in linguistics, and I think maybe that's why these words capture my mind. So the questions that we're going to talk about today, because as a politician, I think what she was trying to say, in a very direct way, was when we communicate to the public, we're going to use the word conservation. Okay, we're never not going to say that word. But what is it? again, what does it mean? So we're going to kick this off with two questions that I've had, and I can't wait to hear what the conversation is. What do we mean when we talk among ourselves, when we use the word efficiency, savings, or conservation as a water community? And secondly, what do we mean or say when we communicate those ideas to the public? And those are two different things. There's the sender and the receiver, and something can also go bad in the middle there. So those are the questions I'm going to ask our panelists to try to tackle, and I can't wait to listen and learn. You want to start?
You want me to start? Okay, I'll be happy to start. Of course, conservation, in my mind, is using less water, and that may open up the possibility for somebody else to use that water. Efficiency is one way to use less water, of course. If you use water more efficiently, you may not need as much for whatever it is you're doing. But efficiency doesn't necessarily mean you're conserving water and using less in total. I mean, I can put a high efficiency shower head in, but if I take a longer shower now, then I haven't really saved any water. And I like long showers, so I don't plan on saving a lot of water that way. At any rate, it creates some complexities for the public in why are we conserving water? Because conserving water, again, is using less. Well, if I'm going to use less, then does that mean somebody else is going to use the water that I'm saving? And one of the interesting things I find about the 400,000 acre feet of conservation that we talk about in the water plan is folks are going to save or use less water so that we can then meet the demands of future population expansion or growth in our areas as one solution. And that's an interesting concept for my customers, and not sure that that's one that's necessarily well received. You're going to conserve water so that we can then serve another customer. I think when we talk about conservation with our public, we certainly think more in terms of you're going to save money and or you're going to create a more reliable, drought-resistant water provider to serve your needs over the long term. But anyways, I'll stop there because that was too much.
All right. I'll just say ditto, I think. That's pretty much what I think, too. It's, that's the idea is that the efficiency, I ran into this years ago during the 2002 drought, and you maybe think of this with car washes. And we had, city council really wanted to shut down all the car washes. And because they were very obvious water users, right? And so we got to make a statement, we got to shut these guys down. And so I looked at the use, and it was like 0.006% of the whole demand for that year. I'm like, well, hold on a second. Why are we shutting these guys down when a restaurant probably uses way more than them? So we look at this thing. So we said, okay, let's work with them. Let's get them to put more efficient nozzles in. And that way, we are not telling them that they can only serve 1,000 customers, but we're going to get them per unit, per car, we're going to get them down to a certain amount of per gallon per minute maybe, let's say. And then we're not telling them how they run their business or how many customers they can have. We're going to say that per unit, you're going to use less water. And so that's kind of how I look at that as efficiency. And then it gets that kind of point out. It kind of diffuses the whole situation. And like Mark was saying that, you can get some demand reduction from efficiency. But if your customer base, if you start serving 10,000 cars a day, your total volume is probably going to go up, even if you've reduced from 0.5 gallons to 0.3 gallons per minute in those nozzles. And so it kind of depends. It's almost a multi-stage process where you've got the efficiency happening and you've reduced your demand, but then that next step is now what do you do with that? Are you calling it savings? Are you calling it a demand reduction? Are you storing it in a reservoir for future drought reserve? Are you serving new growth? Are you letting it go down in times for in-stream flows, or are you, maybe selling it to wholesale to another customer base somewhere else? So it's not very easy to kind of message that in a soundbite to the public. It's like there's a lot that goes into this, and I think that's something that we need to be better at is getting that, communicating that message, saying that. When somebody says, I understand conservation, I just got to shut my nozzle off. It's like, well, we don't want you to turn off all the water, but we want you to use it more efficiently and still have the same great landscape you want in your yard or have the same process, take the same type of shower. So I think that's kind of where we're going, and that's kind of where I'm at too, because it's a multi kind of stage process in how you manage that water. You can set up your initial idea of how you're going to reduce it, but then you got to figure out what you're going to do with that demand reduction, if you're going to get that or not, I think. And so it's a management decision that has to be made at that point, and how you're going to operationalize that water. I'll just leave it there.
To not repeat what both Mark and Kevin said, I look at this as a planned management of a natural resource, and that natural resource is a limited natural resource, which is water. And being a municipal supplier of water, we tend to look at things in gallons per day and peak day demand, and how we can continue to reduce both of those. So at the end of the day, we can defer capital improvement projects, which in our case would be the expansion of one of our 2 filtration plants. So it's important also, I think, that when you're looking at conservation and trying to explain to the customer, you really focus and cater that discussion to the audience. We do everything from 5th grade tours at our plant, and their most concerns or their most questions are, is there any ever fish in your treatment plant? Or I'm always afraid they're going to want to jump in and swim on my flock paddles. But, and then when you're talking to customers that come here a couple times a year, maybe from the East Coast, where they, as we heard earlier, receive 30+ inches a year, they don't really understand why we're even doing this. So it takes a different mindset to talk to those folks. So I think it's important that we always, as a supplier, have a common, consistent message out there, which is important that everyone understands, that we must all do our part to conserve, but we're all doing it in a little different way.
I come from a little different perspective since I'm a downstream ag user on the South Platte. So to kind of facilitate some discussion here, I did a couple of things. I looked up the definition of water conservation. The one I found was water conservation refers to the preservation, control, and development of water resources, both surface and groundwater, and the prevention of pollution. So I think that the term conservation has changed. The definition has changed a little bit back in the day when there were conservancy districts and conservation districts that were being formed. It was the storage of water and retiming, like Representative Martin said, retiming for later use. And that's the way that we kind of look at that conservation in agriculture. But the problem is sometimes conservation and efficiency are used interchangeably, and they're not the same. And so I came up with a few numbers just to kind of prove a point. So it was a little bit eye-opening for me. Our district has become more sprinkler irrigated, so we're becoming more efficient. I've been at the North Sterling Irrigation District for 25 years, and when I first started, we were maybe 10%, maybe even a little bit lower, sprinkler irrigated. And in the mid-90s, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of the USDA, started cost-sharing sprinklers for farmers. So they used to cost-share concrete ditches, concrete line ditches, gated pipe, different things like that. And they began to cost-share sprinkler irrigation systems. So our farmers began to put in lots of sprinkler irrigation system. And we're kind of a hilly district, and we flood irrigated everything. We weren't very efficient. So I just used a few numbers. So I looked prior to 1994 and prior at our diversions, and then from 95 to 2016 at our diversions. So we've increased our diversions because we're now sprinkler irrigated by 11% from the river. So you have to keep in mind, we're on the South Platte, we're a water short system. And so we've increased our diversions by 11%, and that's predominantly because farmers can irrigate earlier. It's easier. They don't have to V out their ditches. They don't have to burn their ditches. They we can start our ditch, they can put it in their ponds and start pumping right away, the surface water. So that they do that with sprinkler irrigation. They also last longer. Our farmers used to get tired by the end of the season carrying, siphon tubes and digging holes and whatever they needed to do to flood irrigate. So we run into October, which we usually shut off in September. So we might go to October 15th or beyond. So we're running longer. We're able to irrigate our alfalfa when that would be the crop that we would stop irrigating just so that we'd save enough water for our corn or our sugar beets or whatever else we're growing. So we divert 11% more. We deliver about 10% more because we have some loss in our inlet canal to our reservoir. But our efficiency has gone up from about 55 or 60% efficient to 76% efficiency. So in the end, our consumptive use has gone up 45%, from 33,600 acre feet every year to 46,600 acre feet every year. So I get these questions all the time that say, if you farmers would just be more efficient, we'd have enough water for the water plan, and then everybody would be okay. But that's not the case. We're a water short system. We're in a water short river. And when we're able to become more efficient, our yields go up. So we might, instead of having 5 ton of alfalfa, we raise 7 ton of alfalfa now per acre. And so that's just an illustration of how by farmers being more efficient in a water short system, it doesn't necessarily, as Mark mentioned, it doesn't necessarily save water. It's no different than taking a longer shower, but we're growing more crops with it, so we're becoming more efficient, but we're not creating any additional water for the water in the water plan.
So I really like that example you gave just there, and I want to circle back to the conservation goal in the state water plan, the 400,000 acre feet, because as you talked, it kind of triggered that thought in my mind. Castle Rock's 5-year average is about 117 gallons per capita per day right now, and I look at the 400,000 acre feet, I was thinking to myself, well, what does that mean individually for my customers? What do we need to do to meet that long-term stretch goal? And the bottom line is, I did some fuzzy math, and it was really fuzzy to try to figure out, but the bottom line I came up with is around 54% reduction per customer to meet that 400,000. And of course, what that means really is a reduction in indoor use for my customers, so shorter showers or something along those lines, washing clothes less often, but also a wholesale change in their outdoor water use with respect to landscape. So basically almost an elimination of irrigated outdoor landscapes to meet that stretch goal if I was just looking at the customers I have today. In other words, conserving enough from those customers to contribute to that 400,000 acre feet, assuming all 5.6 million people in Colorado did the same level of conservation, might get you on the order of that number that you need to get to. And I keep going back to, that'd be a really tough message to the customers to say, well, we want you to conserve 54% more water that you're using so that we can then grow the town and grow the state with additional folks. We're going to take that water you're saving and serve additional customers. So it's not that it's undoable, it's just a very challenging conversation with our customers. Obviously, they want to save money, they want drought protection, and those kinds of things. And that's the other piece of this 400,000 acre foot stretch goal is what are we doing with that water that we save? If we're serving more customers, we're creating a situation where we have less drought protection potentially. So anyway, it's very complicated from that standpoint, but Jim's comments are right along that line. More efficient, but we're now using more because we're producing more probably.
And I would add to that, if we're going to talk about numbers, I want to put some of our numbers on. Our water conservation plan, thanks to Mr. Jay Gallagher, was approved back in 2012. So we're about 5 years into it. And I went back and just looked at some of our annual usage. In 2007 was the only year that we used over 1 billion gallons of water, both in the city of Steamboat and also our district, which equates to about 3,100 plus acre feet. I then went back and looked at our average since the Water Conservation Plan, which is about 5 years old, and we're down to about 2,600 acre feet of water, which is a pretty substantial decrease, which I'm very proud of, and I think, Jay, you should be proud of also. But moving forward, what that allows us to do, back to efficiency, is not have to focus so much on an upgrade to an existing plant, but to developing redundancy, whether it's a separate supply to our Fish Creek watershed water, or something on another source here in Steamboat, i.e. the Elk River. We are in the process now of upgrading our treatment plant, which is a secondary source on the Yampa River. So it's really kind of been able to give us some time to step back and not worry about having to be designing and potentially engineering and going to construction on an upgrade to an existing plant, but looking at everything else that is important to our facilities, our structure, et cetera. So, efficiency is getting more out of something by using less, if you will, but it's also an opportunity to really step back and look at infrastructure and try to understand what needs to be done to create alternative sources so you're not shoestringed, if you will, into one source. So that's been a benefit of us being able to reduce substantially here in the last 5 or 6 years.
I'd like to say something too, is for that 400,000 acre foot goal, since I didn't really say that in the first opening part. So you look at this 400,000 acre foot goal, and it's pretty giant, right? And it's pretty scary. And you're like, how the heck are we going to do this? But in the same breath, you're looking at this as an aspirational goal, because you've got to shoot for something. And to be honest, when this was formulating through over the last number of years, I was definitely not a fan of a statewide percentage reduction. That to me is really difficult, because everybody's at different points in their history of what they've been doing along the way, and they've got different lengths of time and different distances to get to. But having something to shoot for is, I think, very important. And that's how you bring people along. You've to kind of develop this conservation ethic across the state, you've got to have something to shoot for. And just thinking of Castle Rock, since you guys have been doing such great work for so long, you're probably far ahead of a lot of other people in the state. And so there's still mileage to be gained from other parts of the state that maybe haven't had to do this yet. And to be honest, everybody's going to have to do something like this in the future. We're talking about somewhere 5 more million people. The math doesn't add up when you think of 5 million more people coming to the state. That's a lot of people. And so how are we going to manage these new people? And I think there's places across the state that can start this now and be doing this and getting demand reductions over time. Even something like even the Denver metro area, with Denver Water, I think they're talking about their total volume is less than it was in the early 70s, or the same amount. And they've added, I don't know how many more million people, since that time. And so there is some mileage to be gained out of that, and it might not be reduced from this point on, but if you're looking forward and saying, well, if we hadn't done this, if we don't do this, then you're going to have a lot higher demand in the future. So you're kind of looking at it from that way. And also, we've got to address new development as well, and tying in water efficiency with land use planning as well, because that's your next, yet to be built constituents, right? Those folks aren't even here yet. And so how are we going to do that? We've got to do that in a way that is definitely more water smart going forward, because we're going to have all these people. So I think it is a scary kind of big number. 400,000 acre feet is not a small change. And I think we're going to be making strides towards that, because I think we've got to pull people along and develop this conservation ethic more thoroughly in the state. We've done a fantastic job, especially over the last 15 years. I think people have really stepped up. and water providers are doing a really fantastic job. You know, back in the early 2000s, it wasn't such an issue, I don't think. You know, and before that, you know, we're growing, we've got, you know, enough water to supply everybody. You get hit with a massive drought, and we like crises. You know, as humans, we love to crises. You know, we don't love them, but we react to them. You know, when we don't have a crisis, then we're kind of like, hey, everything's good. We're going forward. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that it's really about kind of changing mindsets through a target that can be kind of quantified and understood. It's more relatable that way, instead of just saying, hey, we need to reduce a bunch of water, so please get to work. You know, and everybody's like, well, I don't know what to do. You got to give me some instructions here. So just wanted to add that little bit to that too.
So when we work on changing mindsets, and we use the word conservation or savings and efficiency, and I've heard them even amongst this panel used differently, and I was jotting down some of the different meanings, and we communicate that out to the public. You know, there's the politically charged word of conservation now, right? So I'm a politician, so this is how I think. And it's interesting too, because you also mentioned that efficiency can mean more use, and conservation can fuel new growth. Conservation sometimes, and this is my next question, if we conserve so much, what are we going to do with it? And we actually had a little exchange this morning at a meeting where my colleague says, you know, we're not going to consider conservation without storage along with that. You know, where do we keep it? And I kind of quipped back, oh, we're going to keep it in the streams. So, you know, to me, there's a juxtaposition or an interesting political thing here when we've labeled that word conservation, and even Jim brought up that the original, one of the formal meanings of conservation is to, develop the water. That's why we have the conservation districts, right? That's their charge. So I guess that leads up to one question that Senator Sonnenberg and I have posed between ourselves. Well, two. Does conservation always mean more storage? One, because that's a topical question we were talking about this morning. Another thing is that Senator Sonnenberg and I have talked about that we like to ask the experts on is if we go to some more water reuse, which brings up some ideas of, oh, that's conserving, we're reusing, we're going to recycle, or use it 2-3 times. Does that create a timing issue, and how does that interact with the prior appropriation doctrine? Those are two simple questions.
I don't know.
These are things that we're really talking about on the Water Resource Review Committee.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, you know, I was just going to say, I mean, conservation is a management tool ultimately, and like I said, if you conserve in one place, that water may be used in another location for another purpose or more, you know, even if you use water more efficiently. So it becomes a management tool, which is why conservation districts, that wording comes from that, I'm sure. And I certainly, as a municipal water provider, would argue that, yes, if we're going to conserve, we need more storage to store water that we conserve for whatever purpose we need in the future. It does also, I think as Frank was saying, provide you flexibility to reduce your capital costs in, you know, the near term. So you can meet some of your demands with conservation, with water that was not used by other customers, to avoid having to build the next water treatment plant. And that provides you time to plan for that and do a better job from a financial standpoint. And then I'll leave the reuse question for somebody else for a minute.
You know, I gotta, so something you said struck me when you were talking about, it said conservation fuels new growth. And that's an interesting.
Well, it can. I mean, it was
It
stated.
can. Well,
it was stated. I mean, and that's.
I'd say there's a lot of other things that fuel new growth. I mean, because, you know, it's almost like you've got to decouple that, because, you know, you can use that as a management tool to supply new growth, or you don't have to. You can use it for something else, you know. So it's something that doesn't actually fuel it, I don't think. You know, I think having a strong economy in a place and having, you know, other things that help you build things, that's something that would do it. And if you have enough water, you know, and that's something that does help grease that, I think, you know, and help, you know, if somebody, you know, if chip manufacturers come in somewhere and they say, I don't know if you got enough water resources for us, we're going to go somewhere else. that's a whole different topic. So I think it's interesting to kind of tease that out a little bit, because I don't think it'll fuel it, but it can help serve it if you so desire. And again, I got to go back to that management tool. I think it's really important to think about this as in a holistic kind of water resource management portfolio. This is one of your tools that you use, and storage could be complement to that as well in your water resources portfolio. I think it's important to keep thinking that. And it's not just because you want to have storage, but it's because you're managing your system in a more holistic way, and storage is one of those parts of that. And I think you've got to really remember that conservation is just but one tool that you can use. I think it's a pretty important tool, but not everybody's using it the same way, and not everybody has to use it the same way. And I think that's where we get down to this individual water provider needs in their system, where we can't have a blanket statewide thing that says everybody must do the exact same thing, because everybody's at a different point in time and resources. So, but I think it's really important to stress that it's part of a package of tools that we need to exploit further, I think.
Storage, we have 2 buckets of storage. One is about 4,200 acre feet. The other one's about 370. So we have fairly minimal storage. Our goal every year is to make sure that storage is full, and we are fortunate enough to draw that water from Buffalo Pass, and there's been only 2 years in the last 30 or so where there hasn't been enough water equivalent up there to fill those reservoirs if we actually emptied those reservoirs. So our reservoirs generally fill every year, no matter how dry it is. But throughout the summer, we want to keep those full, because the likelihood of us being able to even entertain building additional storage and getting the permits that are able to enlarge them and or build new would be pretty unlikely at this point. So we feel that, if we can store as much as we can through the summer and then get us through that fall and into the winter, then we usually have ample supply to start into the spring, and then it fills up again. The only other thing I wanted to mention about keeping water in the stream and helping with the water temperature and the riparian habitat and the fish population is our district on a real busy day will only really take about 10 CFS out of Fish Creek. Fish Creek interjects with the Yampa River here in town. So when you compare 10 CFS to a river that runs on average in the summer upwards of 2 to 250, sometimes less, sometimes more depending on the year, our impact to that stream is pretty minimal, but it is an impact, and we want to try to keep that flow down Fish Creek into the Yampa River. So we've always done that to try to supplement recreation, fishing, temperature, et cetera.
You have to remember I'm speaking from a South Platte perspective, so keep that in mind. And the reason that we could become more efficient and use additional water later is because we had storage. So storage is an important part if you want to use that. And we used it to grow more bushels of corn, more tons of hay, whereas a municipality would use it to have more houses or whatever they may choose to do with that water. But it doesn't necessarily directly relate to more water in a stream. And to give you an example of that on the South Platte, our native annual flows are 1.4 million acre feet. We get, you heard Mark Waggy say about 300,000 from trans-basin diversion. I've heard 400,000, I've heard 500,000. On average, I always thought it was around 400,000. So we have 1.8 million acre feet of water annually that we on the South Platte can use. We divert from the surface 4 million acre feet of water every year. We pump 500,000 acre feet of groundwater every year. And we let 400,000 acre feet run out of the state every year. So you think about this math, and it just doesn't make any sense. But when irrigation was first introduced, we had a lot of leaky ditches that was stored in the underground aquifer on the South Platte River. In some places, the aquifer raised 100 feet. In 1922, there was a measurement of 100 feet of increased aquifer water in the aquifer. And so you have this water that feeds the river. The river used to dry up near Fort Morgan in the summertime, in July. It's now a flowing river every year. So we use it, and we reuse it, and we redivert it, and reuse it, and redivert it 7 times from Denver to the state line. So as a whole, the South Platte is very efficient. So when I become more efficient, the people downstream, or if a municipality reuses the water, Aurora Prairie Waters Project is a perfect example, they're reusing their reusable effluent, and they're pumping it back up, treating it, and use it. That's well within their right to do that, but it affects somebody downstream. It doesn't put more water in the stream. It actually takes a little bit of water out of the stream, same as me being efficient. I'm efficient as a North Sterling irrigation district, but the South Platte is no more efficient in the use of its water because the water that used to run off, the Julesburg irrigation district used to pick up and use in their ditch. And kind of an interesting little tidbit is the Julesburg irrigation district has a 1904 direct water right. We have a 1914 direct water right. When we don't have as much water running off our system, the 1904 water right calls out our 1914 water right, so we get less water. And it happens up and down the South Platte. And most of the farmers have senior water rights, so when we become more efficient and use a little bit more water, and somebody downstream doesn't get the water that used to run off our system, they put a call and it stretches all the way up the river, not just to agriculture users, but to municipalities on their reservoirs that are junior to our reservoirs. So if you look at each individual system, whether it's Castle Rock or Steamboat or whatever, and you become more efficient, you're doing more with your water. But in a system like the South Platte, you're not necessarily as a whole becoming any more efficient. So there's just downstream effects in a watertight system that most people wouldn't think of, whether when you reuse it or when you conserve a little bit and save it for development later. That's less water that flows down the system, and every little, it's like a balloon. You push over here and it pops out over here, and there's an effect in a system like the South Platte.
Does anyone want to talk more about water reuse and how that affects the prior appropriation doctrine, or do you feel
Oh,
like
okay. I talked about it a little bit just in the rebound call. So
and from a municipality standpoint, well, go ahead, Jim.
no, with the rebound, when you reuse, it doesn't really affect the prior appropriation system, except that it may change the call. So it might be a little more senior call because you took water out of the river. The prior appropriation system is flexible enough to allow all of this to happen with the way we have it set up, but it doesn't necessarily change the prior appropriation system, but it changes the call on the river at any time.
Reuse obviously is, in my mind, efficient use of water. So basically, you're reusing that water in a much more efficient manner. If you're, for example, for Castle Rock, if we capture the water right downstream from our wastewater plant, or even go to direct potable reuse someday, that's much more efficient than letting it go all the way down to the Prairie Waters Project and pumping it all the way back up to Castle Rock from there. So again, reuse in my mind is a lot about using the water efficiently. And when we're not using the water efficiently, to Jim's point, that water that we have the right to use that we didn't capture ends up benefiting other folks downstream. And that water may be our right to use, but if we don't use it, Jim's probably pretty happy that it shows up down there.
I usually flush twice when I go to Denver.
Yeah.
We're going to leave a few minutes at the end for question and answer, but I think, just to sort of, so what I'm hearing here, just an observation is obviously water is just a classic issue of distribution of a scarce resource. And it's also, in my mind, it's the engineering, it's the legal, it's the legislation, but it's also a social construct And I think that's what brings us all here together. And these words that we use and when we communicate out, we have to be careful when we use them, especially to the public who doesn't spend their entire life devoted to these complex issues. So I heard the word management, and I think we're moving more in Colorado to integrated management of conjunctive use. It was the topic of yesterday and those sorts of things, especially more regionalism and these sorts of things. So those are interesting. There's also some savings, net savings, in my observation, to be had in terms of energy or plants you don't have to build if you're not using as much, or did I say redundancy, and some of these other things. If you talk to, I'm sure some of you know Chris Gomez, the economist at CSU, who's an ag resource economist, he'll talk about, while we're not necessarily net saving water and we're retiming it, we are having other savings which are beneficial to the state and our, the people in our state, most importantly. So I don't know if you guys want to have a wrap-up comment or two, and then we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Well, just to piggyback on what you just said about timing, I think when you use water efficient, so most of our water, the largest portion of our water for many of us is in the summer. That's when it's used. And those peak demands drive the cost of water up significantly. For example, in Castle Rock, we have to run up to 5 water treatment plants in the summer, and in the winter, we run 1. Clearly, that's much more expensive. So again, efficiency can also help all of us reduce the cost impacts to our systems, which ultimately rates and fees and costs drive a lot of what we do and how we use the resource. And I'm happy to say, for the benefit of our customers, it's still the least expensive thing you can buy, much less expensive than the bottled water that Frank was talking about. And much better.
Much better. Go ahead. All right, I'll go. So I think just to kind of wrap up on that too, it's important to keep the, we talked about this in our phone call about the context and how we're seeing the differences between the municipal actions and the ag users' actions, and how these things kind of relate to each other, but they're very different. You know, we're seeing this stuff, and the sprinkler example was really eye-opening for me when we talked about this yesterday. It just, in my mind, it was really hard to wrap my head around. Like, this doesn't make sense, but it's happening. So how do we deal with these different contexts as they relate to each other? The municipal context is very different than the ag context, obviously, and one actor affects another actor, and I think that's where we're trying to look at this as in a more holistic manner as well, as how do our management actions affect other people, but what do our inactions do as well? And if we're not conserving and reusing, let's say in the Denver metro area, what happens to if somebody, water providers do need water and they got to go? They're going to get it from a couple different places, from the West Slope or ag. So, actions and inactions both have consequences, I think, and that's something to kind of keep in mind and how we go forward. It's going to be it's not going to be an easy walk to walk, but that's just something I want to kind of throw out there, is that the idea of the importance of the context and where we're all operating in is not so isolated as we think sometimes.
Just a few comments that I would make. When we set our targets in our water conservation plan, 70% of the savings of water really fell on the utility. And when I say the utility, that was Mount Warner Water and the city of Steamboat Springs. Those were really geared towards leak detection technology, meter enhancement, advanced metering infrastructure, raw water conversion at some of our parks in the city, and distribution system repairs and replacement. But we also gave some of that burden to the customer, and most of that was indoor and outdoor best management practices, whether we're water-saving fixtures, irrigation technology, et cetera. So what I'd like to close with is I want to continue to work with the partners in this community, leverage that technology, because the technology doesn't get any worse, it gets much better. I think it's important that we become as sophisticated as possible saving water. And then also, let's give the data to the customers. We have a system in place where a customer can sign up through our AquaHawk alerting system and see their usage. And we get notifications when that usage has a certain spike above a certain parameter. And once a customer is engaged with that process, it gives them a little bit of control, a little bit of buy-in, and a little bit of ownership of how they use their water. So I think it's definitely incumbent on the utility to do everything possible, but also we want to engage those customers for their assistance also.
One thing that I forgot to mention, in case there's any water attorneys in the audience, we're irrigating the same acreage we always have irrigated.
Nice.
One other concept that I'd just like to bring up real quick is, and I think it could be considered conservation that has to do with the Colorado Water Plan and ATMs altogether, alternative transfer methods. A lot of municipalities, I've talked to municipal providers, and they have to have enough water to carry them through a drought, and that makes sense. I mean, you can't build these things without being able to carry themselves through the drought, and they also use their bluegrass to do that as well. So they curtail their customers on their outdoor watering and things like that, so that they have enough to carry them through. And I guess one of the things that I would like to see more emphasis on is maybe working with agricultural providers to be that bluegrass reservoir or to be that drought insurance. And I think as an agricultural provider, I would rather do that than a rotational fallowing. When you rotationally fallow, you're guaranteeing that you're going to dry up 30% of your land every year, and you're going to rotate it around. And that's similar to buy and dry. The farmers still own that, but I would rather see where if we can work it out, and it only works with some storage vessels in place, some infrastructure, but I would rather see where the agriculture provider would be a drought insurance so that you would recover from a drought on your reservoirs or however that would work. But I think that would be much more palatable to the agricultural provider than just the rotational fallowing concept. And I think that, we have both of these goals, conservation and we have ATMs, and I think they kind of dovetail together in that little bit.
Great. Well, thanks. We have we have 5 minutes. Oh, we only have 5 minutes left for. I'm getting conflicting messages. 7, 6 and a half. We'll take some questions now if anybody has questions. If not, you get out early. Yeah. Okay.
I just have a comment. It's because of the priority system that we're able to reuse the water on the South Platte River. It's not the other way around. The priority system enables the great reuse of the South Platte River. And if it wasn't for the priority system, we wouldn't be able to do what we're able to do right now. And Mark, I would only add that conservation, particularly in Castle Rock's environment, means taking less water out of storage.
Any other questions or comments? Observations?
I had kind of a question. I mean, we've talked a lot about conservation being very important and a very cheap method of ensuring there's future water resources available. I think historically we see conservation get ramped up a lot during drought, and then as the institutional memory of the effects of that drought go away, we start to see conservation budgets get slashed, people get kind of let go or reprioritized within the organization. Are we beginning to see that culture change institutionally in utilities where conservation is that kind of long-term view and they're not getting cut when the budget gets tight? I mean, even in California, we're kind of seeing that already. Hasn't even been a year. Do we see that kind of culture shift in particularly the municipal side of kind of having that long-term commitment for conservation?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have a year-round conservation program at Castle Rock, and every gallon that we can either use more efficiently or save is, to John's point, water we can leave in our deep underground reservoir for future needs. So certainly water we can save in the winter through conservation and efficiency is water that's available potentially in the summer to meet peak demands.
And I would echo that comment. we are limited in resources to manage a conservation plan, but we, as part of our conservation plan that we did back in 2011, one of our goals was to prepare people for that drought and for those seasons when the water just wasn't available. So we've tried to be aggressive with always having a certain amount of stage 1 restrictions in place, and then being consistent on how we identify and put in place our stage 2, which is essentially, and Mark and I talked about this on our phone call, not so much a water restriction, but we need to change the language to a water schedule. So people get in kind of the mindset again, that, hey, this is reality, and we shouldn't have to wait for a drought to do something. So that kind of changing of people's thought process on how important water is what one of our main goals is.
And I'd like to add something to it, that I think it's really important to differentiate between long-term conservation and drought response. That's something that gets really confused, and unfortunately, but like these guys are talking about, that's exactly what they're doing. They're differentiating the two, because in 2002 drought, hadn't had a drought for 20 years, right? So it's like everybody's like, what? What's this thing coming back again? What drought? And you had to just retool everything, and then everybody staffed up. But you use that momentum, and you use that momentum from the drought, and then you separate those two ideas, and you go forward with that long-term planning to buffer the drought next time, and engage your customers, because from that 1983 to 2002, there was not very much contact with customers on the idea of drought. 20 years is a long time. You got a lot of new people moved to the state, so this allows, since 2002, for the utilities to have a really great contact with their customers to prepare them for the next drought, and kind of and bring them along. As the term I always use is, you've got water customers, and what you're trying to do is move them from water customers to being water stewards. You've got customers only consume. They're not thinking about that. They're not managing anything. They're consuming. But you've got stewards in their hand are actually thinking about their management actions and managing their own water at the household level as well. So it's one of those things, it's an engagement tool that I think we should always use a drought to re-engage, but also maintain that engagement throughout.
So again, changing the language we use is important when we're conveying the meaning of what our goals are, right? That's my observation. Any other questions, comments? There's something.
Yeah, the 400,000 acre-foot goal, is that a reduction in diversions or reduction in consumptive use?
Oh, good question.
Yeah, I think that's my question, is
Yeah.
what does that really mean? I think we as a state need to have a conversation about what does that goal really mean to individual users, whether it be ag, municipal, industrial, and how do we start to get our heads around that reduction?
And what if the reduction causes more use? Do you get credit for that reduction?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, in the looking at, again, the context, right, looking at the municipal system, it's saying, hey, overall, the municipal systems are reducing their demand by this X amount, right? And so it could be consumptive, but some of it might not be either, I don't think, because you've got indoor use in a municipal system, so it's going to be very minimally consumptive. So I think that's something it's not an easy thing to tease out. Whether or not it turns into less diversions, it depends on what the utility is doing with that water too, I think. So there's a lot of facets to that are the details kind of come down to the local provider, I think, of how they're getting there, if that makes sense.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Joe.
Just a follow-up. So we talk about the gap and how does that relate to the gap, right? So we have these goals of 400,000 acre-feet of conservation and so much reuse. So every acre-foot that we conserve or reuse, is that an acre-foot of reduction in the gap? How does that tie to solving the gap? Is it a one-for-one?
I think that's a great question too. I think it again, it goes back to that local context, how they're using that water, because it may be a reduction in that gap, or if it depends on how they're using it, I think is really defines how that gap gets addressed. And that was always a really difficult thing, coming from the state level. It's really hard because, the last SWASI in 2010, trying to assign a number on or a percentage of what that is actually reducing the gap by. And it's, you know, you can't be basically putting words in local providers' mouths saying, well, you're gonna reduce the gap by this much, you're gonna store this much, or whatever you're gonna do. It was really hard, and so we got a lot of pushback from that. You know, it was like, so I think there was a number that was put out there, I don't know, years ago, about 50% or something would be applied to the gap. But that's something that is up to the individual water provider, I think. That's really an individual management decision, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, one more and then our time's up.
Yeah. In the end, I mean, it depends on what you're doing. So if you're using less Denver Basin aquifer water, yeah, it's probably going to be applied to the gap by your conserving some of that water. But if you're reusing it, and historically that went down to an ag provider, we used it anyway, I don't think you can count that as filling the gap. So there's a distinction, and it's not necessarily what people think. If I conserve 1 acre foot here, that it results in 1 acre foot reduction in the gap. I don't think that you can simply make that calculation.
Well, thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, and thanks for the discussion, and I'm sure we'll have many more.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists.